They told her to leave or pay, and Clara Whitmore felt the words land heavier than the pain in her body because pain at least made sense. But this was something colder, something quieter, something that didn't shout, but still pushed her out. Just the same, she stood beneath the hospital lights that washed everything in a pale, unforgiving white, her dress clinging to her skin, her breathing uneven, one hand pressed to her stomach as another wave tightened, deep and slow, like the world itself was closing in around her. And still no one stepped closer, not the man flipping through a magazine, not the woman whispering into her phone, not the nurse who had already turned away, as if the decision had been made long before Clara ever walked through those doors. "Ma'am, you need to settle your balance before we can admit you." The voice came again, flat, practiced, like it had been said 1,000 times before and would be said 1,000 more. Clara nodded, even though she didn't understand what she was agreeing to. Her fingers trembled as she reached into her bag, finding nothing but a folded piece of paper and a photograph, edges worn from being held too many times. The photograph showed a man smiling, one hand resting lightly over hers, a promise that now felt like something borrowed from another life. She swallowed hard, blinking away the sting in her eyes, as another contraction rose sharper, this time forcing her to grip the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. "Please," she managed, barely louder than a breath. "I just need a little time." The nurse didn't meet her eyes. "We can't do that." The answer came quick, clean, final, like a door closing somewhere far behind. Clara felt her strength slip, just enough for the room to tilt slightly, the hum of fluorescent lights growing louder, the smell of antiseptic sharp in her nose. She tried to steady herself, but her knees bent anyway, and she sank down, not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly, folding into herself, as if making less space might make her less of a problem. The world around her didn't stop. It never did. Footsteps continued, voices murmured, life moved forward in inches and seconds, and she was simply no longer part of it. Then boots entered the edge of her vision, worn leather, dust still clinging to them, like they had come from somewhere open, somewhere far from walls and rules and forms. Clara didn't look up at first. She didn't have the strength, but she felt the pause, felt the weight of someone choosing not to walk past. And that alone was enough to make her lift her eyes slowly. The man standing there wasn't polished or clean. His coat carried the road with it, his face marked by sun and time, but his eyes were steady, not curious, not pitying, just steady, like he had already decided something before she ever spoke. He said nothing at first, just took off his jacket and placed it gently on the cold floor beneath her, as if that small act might soften the world a little. Then he crouched down close enough for her to see the faint scar along his jaw, close enough for her to hear his breath, even and calm. "Easy now," he said quietly, not asking, not demanding, just there. She didn't know why, but her shoulders eased just a fraction. Her grip loosened from the counter as he helped her sit upright, careful, deliberate movements, like she wasn't something fragile, but something worth handling. Right. The nurse's voice returned sharper now. "Sir, she needs to check in, or she needs to leave." The man didn't look away from Clara when he answered, "She's not going anywhere." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Something in the way he said it settled into the room, like weight shifting under the floorboards. The nurse hesitated just long enough to notice. "Then you'll need to cover the cost." The man finally stood, reaching into his pocket, slow, deliberate fingers closing around something unseen. Clara watched him through blurred vision, not understanding why he hadn't walked away like the others, why he had stopped at all. He pulled out a watch, old silver, worn smooth at the edges, the kind of thing a man doesn't carry unless it means more than money. He held it for a second, turning it once in his palm, before placing it on the counter with a quiet click. "Put it on me," he said, and for the first time since she walked in, Clara felt something shift, not outside, not in the room, but inside her, a small, fragile space where the idea of being alone cracked just enough to let something else in. And she didn't know yet who this man was or what it would cost him to stay, but she knew one thing with a certainty that settled deeper than fear. He hadn't come here to leave. The watch had not even stopped ticking when everything began to move faster. Papers appeared, voices lowered. The same nurse who had refused her minutes ago now reached for a clipboard with a different kind of urgency, as if the small piece of silver on the counter had shifted more than policy, it had shifted permission. "We need to get her to a room now," someone said, and suddenly hands were there, not rough, not careless, just efficient, guiding Clara onto a narrow bed, wheels squeaking softly as they pushed her down a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and something faintly metallic. She kept her eyes open as long as she could, the ceiling lights passing one by one like counting seconds, each one a reminder that she was still here, still Breathing still not alone, because when her fingers moved searching they found fabric not her own, the sleeve of the man who had stayed Ethan. He had not said his name yet, but she would learn it soon enough. And he did not pull away. He walked beside the bed, steady pace matching the rhythm of the wheels, his presence quiet but unshaken like a fence post in open land, the kind that does not move even when the wind insists. A nurse glanced at him as they turned a corner. "Family stays in the waiting area," she said without slowing. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He just answered in that same calm tone that seemed to settle things before they could rise. "Then I will wait wherever she is." The nurse hesitated just a fraction, then kept walking as if choosing not to make this the moment. She pushed back. Clara felt another wave build, stronger this time, stealing her breath, forcing her eyes shut for a second longer than she wanted. When she opened them again, the room had changed, smaller, quieter. Machines humming low beside her bed, a window showing nothing but night pressed against the glass, like the world had narrowed down to this single space. She tried to speak, but her voice came out thin. "You do not have to stay." The words barely made it across the room, but he heard them anyway. He always seemed to hear the things others missed. He stood near the door, hat in his hands, turning it slowly like it gave him something to do while he chose his words. "I know," he said simply, and that was all he offered. No explanation, no condition, just that, and somehow it carried more weight than anything else she had heard that day. Time did not pass in a straight line. After that it stretched, folded in on itself, measured in breaths and quiet instructions, in the soft beeping of machines and the steady presence of a man who never stepped too close, but never stepped away either. Clara watched him when she could, between moments when the world narrowed to sensation and sound. He spoke little to the staff, answered when asked, signed where they pointed, his handwriting careful, deliberate, like he understood the cost of putting his name on something at one point or another. Nurse entered holding a form. "We will need a contact in case of emergency," she said, glancing between them. Clara looked away. The word contact felt heavier than it should have, like something she no longer had. Ethan did not look at her when he answered. "You can put me down." The nurse raised a brow. "Relationship." There was a pause, not long, but long enough to feel. Then he said, "Put family." The word hung in the air, quiet but solid. Clara felt it settle somewhere deep, not as truth, not yet, but as possibility, something that had not existed an hour ago, now standing there with the same weight as everything else outside the room. Footsteps passed, voices echoed faintly, life continued, but inside that space something had shifted into place, not loud, not dramatic, just a man, a woman, and a choice that had already been made without needing to be spoken again. And for the first time since the doors had nearly closed on her, Clara did not feel like she was about to be turned away. The room felt smaller with every passing minute, not because the walls moved, but because everything inside it mattered more now. The quiet hum of machines, the faint rhythm of footsteps beyond the door, the slow, steady ticking of the clock mounted just above the sink. Clara watched that clock when she could, each second stretching longer than it should, as if time itself was hesitating, unsure of what came next. Another wave rose through her, stronger than before, pulling her focus inward. Her fingers tightened around the thin blanket, and without thinking she reached again, not for the bed, not for the rail, but for him. Ethan was already there, not closer than before, not hovering, but present in the exact space where she needed him. His hand met hers without hesitation, firm but careful, like he understood that strength did not have to be loud to be real. "You are doing fine," he said, his voice low, steady, the kind that did not rush her through the moment, but stayed inside it with her. She shook her head slightly, breath uneven. "I do not feel fine." The words came broken but honest, and he gave a small nod as if that answer made more sense than anything else in the world. "You do not have to feel fine," he replied, and something in that response loosened the tightness in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but permission to be exactly where she was without pretending otherwise. The nurse moved around the room, checking monitors, adjusting something near the bed, her movements practiced, efficient, but softer now, like the edge had worn down since earlier. She glanced at Ethan again. "You can step outside if you need to," she offered, not unkindly this time. Ethan did not even look at the door. "I am fine here," he answered, and the nurse simply nodded, as if that was enough, as if something about him had already proven it. Clara watched that exchange through half-closed eyes, the way no one questioned him anymore, the way his presence had shifted from stranger to something else, something harder to define. Another contraction came, sharper, faster, and she leaned forward instinctively, her grip tightening on his hand. He did not pull back. He did not flinch. He adjusted his stance, slightly grounding himself. Like a man bracing against a storm, he could not stop, but would not walk away from "Breathe with me," he said quietly, matching his inhale to hers, slow, deliberate, giving her something steady to follow when everything else felt uncertain. She tried to match him, and for a moment the room narrowed to just that shared rhythm, in and out, until the wave passed, leaving behind a thin, fragile calm. Clara opened her eyes again, studying his face more closely, now the lines near his eyes, the faint scar along his jaw, the way he held himself like someone who had learned to stay, even when staying was not easy. "You said something before," she whispered, her voice softer now, not from weakness, but from focus. "About your mother." Ethan's gaze shifted just slightly, not away, but inward, like he was choosing whether to open a door he had kept closed for a long time. "She was alone too," he said after a moment, the words simple, but carrying weight that settled into the space between them. Different place, different time, but the same kind of alone. Clara felt that answer more than she understood it. She nodded slowly, her eyes drifting toward the window, where night still pressed against the glass, unbroken. "Did someone stay with her?" she asked, the question barely louder than a breath. Ethan did not answer right away. His jaw tightened just enough to notice. Then he shook his head once. "No," he said, and that single word held more than a story. It held a memory, a choice, a line drawn somewhere in the past that had led him here, to this room, to this moment. Clara turned back to him, her grip on his hand loosening just enough to rest instead of hold. "Then why are you still here?" she asked, and this time he met her eyes fully, no hesitation, no distance. "Because I can be," he said, and there was nothing complicated in it, no grand reason, no expectation, just a truth spoken plain and steady like the ground beneath their feet. Outside the room, the hospital continued its quiet rhythm, doors opening, closing, voices passing by, but inside something had settled into place, not loud, not dramatic, just two people sharing a moment that neither of them had planned and neither of them were walking away from. And as the clock on the wall moved forward 1 second at a time, Clara realized that whatever came next, she would not be facing it alone. The next wave did not come like the others. It arrived slower, heavier, like something gathering strength before it spoke, and Clara felt it before it reached her, a deep pressure that pulled her breath tight and held it there. She leaned forward instinctively, her fingers tightening again around Ethan's hand, and this time she did not try to hide it, did not try to be quiet about it. The room seemed to narrow around that moment, the sound of the monitor steady, but louder, now the faint rustle of fabric as the nurse moved closer, checking something, adjusting something, her voice calm, but firmer now. "It is time to focus, Clara, stay with me." Clara nodded, though her eyes had already closed, her world shrinking down to breath and pressure, and the steady presence beside her. Ethan shifted closer, not crossing any line, but close enough that his voice did not have to travel far. "You are not alone," he said again, not as reassurance this time, but as a fact, something that did not need to be proven anymore. She let those words settle somewhere deeper than thoughts, somewhere that held when everything else slipped. Another contraction rose stronger than before, and this time she did not fight it. She followed the rhythm he had given her earlier, breathing with it, through it, holding on when it peaked, and letting go when it passed. Each cycle leaving her more tired, but also more certain that this moment was moving forward, no matter how it felt, no matter how long it seemed. The nurse glanced at Ethan once more. "You might want to step back now," she said, gently, not pushing, just offering space, but Ethan only shook his head once. "I am staying right here," he answered, and there was something in the way he said it that ended the conversation before it could begin. Clara heard it, even through the haze of sensation, and she turned her head slightly toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do not have to prove anything." Ethan looked at her, not with surprise, but with something quieter, something steadier. "I am not proving anything," he said. "I am just not leaving." And that was all. It was not a promise, not a claim, just a decision held in place. Clara's grip loosened just a little, not because she needed him less, but because she trusted that he would still be there when she reached again. Time blurred again, minutes folding into each other, marked only by the nurse's calm instructions and the steady rhythm of the machines. The outside world felt distant now, reduced to faint echoes beyond the walls, as if everything that mattered had been pulled into this one room, into this one stretch of time. Another voice entered briefly, a doctor this time, calm, measured, assessing, then nodding once. "You are doing well, Clara, keep going." The words passed through her like something she could not fully hold, but Ethan's voice remained clear, anchoring her when everything else shifted. "Right here, He murmured when she tightened again, "Breathe with me." And she did, even when it felt impossible, even when her body told her otherwise. She followed that steady rhythm because it gave her something solid to move towards, something that did not break. The clock on the wall ticked forward unnoticed until suddenly it mattered again, until suddenly the room changed, not in shape, but in feeling. The tension shifting, the nurse's voice sharpening just slightly, not with fear, but with urgency that carried purpose. "Almost there, Clara, stay with me." Clara opened her eyes briefly, searching without knowing why, and found him exactly where he had been, not closer, not farther, just there, his sleeve still caught loosely in her hand, his presence unchanged, as if time had moved around him, but not through him. "Do not go," she whispered, not asking, just stating something she needed to be true. Ethan leaned in just enough for her to hear him clearly. "I am not going anywhere," he said, and this time there was something more in it, not louder, not stronger, just deeper, like the words had settled into him as firmly as they had into her. And for a brief second, between one breath and the next, Clara felt something she had not felt since she walked through those doors. Not fear, not pain, but a quiet, steady certainty that whatever came next, whatever waited on the other side of this moment, she would meet it with someone who had chosen to stay, and that choice made all the difference. The moment did not explode into noise the way Clara expected. It did not break the room open with chaos. Instead, it narrowed everything down into something sharp and focused, like the world had drawn a single line and asked her to follow it. She could feel it now, not just as pressure, but as movement, as change, something real and undeniable. And the nurse's voice cut through, clear and steady. "That is it, Clara. Stay right there. Do not pull away. Stay with it." Clara's breath caught halfway between fear and determination, her fingers tightening again around Ethan's sleeve, not searching this time, but anchoring herself to something that did not shift. Ethan did not speak right away. He did not need to. He adjusted his stance just enough to hold steady beside her, his presence unchanged, like the ground beneath her feet. If she had been standing instead of lying there, another wave came stronger than the last, and Clara let out a sound she had been holding back, not loud, not wild, just honest and raw and human, the kind of sound that does not ask permission. Ethan leaned closer, his voice low enough that it did not compete with anything else in the room. "You are right there," he said. "Do not stop now." And she did not. She followed that voice through the moment, through the weight of it, through the strain that seemed to stretch time itself, until the nurse's tone shifted just slightly, not softer, but brighter, like something had crossed a line. "Yes, Clara, that is it. Keep going." Clara's eyes opened briefly, searching not for the nurse, not for the ceiling, but for him, and she found him exactly where he had been from the beginning, not closer, not farther, just there, his hand steady in hers, his gaze locked on her, like nothing else in the world had claim over that moment. And something inside her settled, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to keep going. The room held its breath in a way that was not real, but felt real. The machines continued their quiet rhythm. The nurse moved with practiced precision. The doctor's voice joined in calm, measured guiding, but it was Ethan's silence that filled the spaces between everything else, a silence that did not feel empty, but full, like it carried every word he did not need to say. Then it happened, not as a single instant, but as a shift, as a release, as something long held finally letting go, and the sound that followed was small at first, then stronger, unmistakable, the cry of new life cutting through the room, clear and certain. Clara's body stilled, not because the world had stopped, but because something inside her had reached its end, and its beginning all at once. Her grip loosened slowly, her hand slipping from Ethan's sleeve, not because she needed less, but because something else now filled that space. The nurse's voice softened. "You did it," she said, and for a moment Clara did not answer. She could not. She turned her head slightly toward the sound, toward the small bundle, now being wrapped carefully, hands moving gently with practiced care. And when she saw the child, when she saw the tiny movement, the rise and fall of breath, something broke open inside her, not pain, not fear, something quieter, something deeper. Ethan stepped back, just half a pace, giving space, without leaving it. His eyes moved from Clara to the child and back again, as if making sure both were real, as if grounding himself in the same certainty. She was just beginning to feel. The nurse approached Clara carefully, placing the child into her arms, and Clara's hands trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of what she was holding, the reality of it, the truth of it. She looked down, then up again, toward Ethan, her voice barely more than air. "You stayed," she said, not as a question, but as something she had to say out loud. Ethan nodded, once not stepping forward, not stepping away, just holding that same quiet place beside her. I said I would. He answered, and the room did not change after that, not in any visible way. The machine still hummed, the lights still burned, white, the hallway still carried distant footsteps. But something had shifted in a way that did not need to be seen to be known, something that began the moment he chose to stay, and now stood there complete in the quiet space between them, where nothing needed to be added and nothing needed to be taken away. The room did not rush after that moment. It settled like dust after a long storm, quiet, but full of everything that had just happened. Clara held the child close, her arms adjusting instinctively, finding a way to support. Something so small yet so real, the warmth of the baby against her chest grounded her in a way nothing else had all night. The faint movement, the soft, uneven breaths, the tiny fingers curling and uncurling as if testing the world for the first time. She watched every motion, as if looking away might make it disappear. Ethan stood a step back, not distant, but careful, giving space. Without stepping out of it, his hands rested loosely at his sides, the same hands that had held steady through every moment before, now still carrying faint marks of what they had been part of. He did not speak right away. He did not need to. The quiet between them was not empty. It was full of understanding. The nurse moved around them gently, adjusting blankets, checking small details, her voice softer, now almost warm. "You both did well," she said, and for a moment Clara closed her eyes, letting those words settle deeper than the others had, because these were not instructions, not demands, just acknowledgement. When she opened them again, she looked toward Ethan, not searching this time, but seeing him fully for the first time since everything had begun. "You never told me your name," she said, her voice still light, but steadier now. Ethan shifted slightly, as if the question required more from him than anything else had. "Ethan," he answered simply. "Ethan Cole." Clara nodded once, repeating it quietly, as if committing it to memory. "Clara," she said, then paused with a faint, almost tired smile. "Clara Whitmore." Ethan gave a small nod in return, as if names made things clearer, even when everything else was still uncertain. The baby stirred softly, drawing Clara's attention back, down, her fingers brushing lightly across the child's cheek, a gesture that came without thought, without effort. "She is strong," the nurse added, glancing at the chart, then at Clara. "Everything looks good." Clara let out a breath she had not realized she had been holding, and in that exhale something inside her loosened, not completely, not all at once, but enough to feel the difference. Ethan watched that moment quietly, the way her shoulders eased, the way her grip softened, not from weakness, but from relief. It was subtle, but real, and it stayed. The nurse finished her checks, then looked toward Ethan. "We will need to move her to recovery soon," she said. "Family can stay for a little while, but then visiting hours will apply." Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the rule without arguing it. Clara heard the word "stay" again, and her gaze lifted back to him, not questioning, not asking, just waiting. Ethan met her eyes for a brief second, then looked toward the door, as if measuring something unseen. The hallway beyond still carried its quiet rhythm, footsteps passing, voices low, the world continuing as it always did, but something in him did not move with it. "I will be right outside," he said finally, not leaving, yet just stating what would come. Clara studied his face for a moment longer, then nodded slowly, accepting the words for what they were, not a promise to remain forever, not a claim to anything more, just a continuation of the same choice he had made from the beginning, to stay as far as he could, and no farther than he was allowed. The nurse began preparing the bed for movement, adjusting rails, checking wheels. Clara shifted carefully, holding the baby close as the room began to change again, not in feeling, but in direction. The night had carried them here. Now something else would carry them forward. Ethan stepped back another half step, giving space as the staff moved in, but he did not turn away, not yet. His eyes remained on Clara and the child, as if making sure they were still there, still real, still part of the same moment that had begun hours earlier with a simple decision. And as the bed began to roll slowly toward the door, Clara looked at him one last time before the threshold, not with fear, not with uncertainty, but with something quieter, something steadier, something that did not need words, because it had already been said in everything he had done and everything he had chosen not to do. And when the door opened and the hallway lights stretched out ahead, she realized that whatever came next, whatever waited beyond that room, there was now a space in her world where someone had chosen to stand, and that space would not disappear even when the door closed behind her. The hallway carried a different kind of silence, not empty, but stretched like something Waiting its turn, Clara felt the motion of the bed beneath her as they moved forward, the wheels turning in a steady rhythm that echoed softly against the polished floor. The baby rested against her chest, wrapped in a blanket that seemed too large for such a small life, yet held her just the same. Clara adjusted her arms carefully, instinct guiding her more than thought, her eyes moving between the tiny face and the passing ceiling lights that slid by one after another like quiet markers of time. Ethan walked beside the bed, not too close, not too far, his steps matching the slow pace without needing to be told. The nurse guided the bed with practiced ease, turning corners, passing doors that opened and closed with soft clicks, each room holding its own story, its own quiet struggles and victories. But Clara did not look at them. She did not need to. This moment was enough. The nurse spoke briefly with someone at the next station, her voice low, then turned back with a nod. "We are almost there," she said. And Clara felt that word almost settle into her chest, not as relief, but as transition, something ending, something beginning. She glanced toward Ethan again, his presence unchanged, his gaze steady, not fixed on her in a way that demanded attention, but present enough that she could find it whenever she needed to. "You can go if you need to," Clara said softly, not because she wanted him to leave, but because something in her told her he had already given more than most would. Ethan shook his head once. "I said I would be right outside," he answered, the same calm tone, the same grounded certainty, and there was something in the repetition that made it feel stronger, not weaker, like a line drawn in place. The bed rolled into a quieter wing, the lights softer, the sounds more distant, as if the hospital itself had stepped back to let this part unfold gently. The nurse guided the bed into a room smaller than the last, but warmer somehow. The window here showed the faintest hint of early morning, a thin line of gray breaking through the darkness. Clara noticed it without thinking. The way night slowly gave way to something else. The bed came to a stop, and the nurse locked the wheels with a quiet click. "We will get you settled here," she said, adjusting the blanket and checking the baby once more, her hands careful, respectful. Clara nodded, though her attention drifted between the room and the man still standing near the door. Ethan stepped back slightly, giving space as the nurse finished her work, his hand resting lightly on the frame of the door, as if marking the boundary he had chosen not to cross. Yet Clara watched that small detail, the way he stayed without entering, the way he remained without claiming anything, and it settled into her differently than anything else had before, not as uncertainty, but as respect. The nurse finished and offered a small, reassuring smile. "I will be back shortly," she said before stepping out, leaving the room quieter than it had been all night. Clara shifted slightly, adjusting the baby in her arms, the small weight grounding her again. She looked toward Ethan once more, the silence between them no longer heavy, no longer uncertain, just there, steady like everything else that had carried them this far. "You do not know me," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, not from weakness, but from honesty. Ethan met her eyes without hesitation. "I know enough," he replied. Clara studied that answer, not fully understanding it, but not needing to either. Something in his tone told her it was not about details, not about past or circumstance, just something simpler, something that did not require explanation. Outside the room, footsteps passed, distant voices murmured, the hospital beginning to wake. As morning edged closer, Ethan glanced briefly down the hallway, then back at her, as if measuring the space between staying and stepping away. "I will be right here," he said again, and this time it felt less like a promise and more like a fact. Clara nodded slowly, her gaze softening as she looked down at the child in her arms, then back up at him, and for the first time since everything had begun, she did not feel the need to ask anything more, because some answers did not come in words, they came in presence, in quiet decisions repeated without hesitation. And as the faint light of morning touched the edge of the window, Clara realized that whatever came next, whatever waited beyond this room, she was no longer standing at the edge of it alone. Morning did not arrive all at once. It slipped in quietly through the narrow edge of the window, a thin gray light stretching across the floor inch by inch until it reached the bed, where Clara sat, half awake, half lost between exhaustion and something steadier. The baby rested against her chest, breathing in soft, uneven rhythms that made time feel slower, more deliberate, like each second mattered more now than it ever had before. The room held a calm that was different from the night, Not heavy, not uncertain, just still, as if everything inside it had settled into place. Clara adjusted the blanket slightly, her fingers moving with more confidence, now guided by instinct rather than hesitation. Her eyes drifted toward the door, not urgently, not searching, just aware. And there he was, exactly where he said he would be. Ethan stood just outside the threshold, leaning lightly against the wall, his hat resting in his hands, his posture relaxed but unchanged, like the hours had moved forward without moving him at all. He had not crossed into the room, not once, but he had not left either, and that quiet line he held said more than anything else. Could a nurse passed by, offering him a brief glance, then a small nod, the kind that came from recognition, not of who he was, but of what he had done. Ethan returned the nod, just as simply, his gaze shifting back toward the room as if drawn by something. He did not question. Clara watched that exchange in silence, something about it settling deeper inside her, not as surprise, but as understanding. People had begun to see him not as a stranger anymore, but as part of the space, part of the story unfolding within those walls. She looked down at the baby again, tracing the outline of a tiny hand with her fingertip. The child stirred slightly, then settled again, and Clara felt something steady take hold in her chest. Not overwhelming, not loud, just present. The door opened softly as the nurse returned, carrying a small tray, her movements unhurried, respectful of the quiet that filled the room. "How are you feeling?" she asked. Clara took a moment before answering, not because she did not know, but because the answer felt larger than the question. "Different," she said finally, and the nurse gave a small, knowing smile, as if that was enough. Ethan shifted slightly outside the door, not stepping in, but closer to the frame enough to be heard without raising his voice. "That is a good kind of different," he said. Clara glanced toward him, a faint smile touching her expression, not bright, not forced, just real. "I think it is," she replied. The nurse finished her checks, then paused at the doorway, glancing between them. "Visiting hours will start soon," she said gently. "You can stay a bit longer if you like." The words hung in the air, not as permission, but as recognition. Ethan nodded once, stepping just inside the room for the first time, not crossing too far, just enough to close the distance that had been there all night. He stopped near the foot of the bed, his presence filling the space. Without taking it over, Clara watched him carefully, not with uncertainty, but with awareness of the moment. Something had shifted. Again, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that could not be undone. "You did not have to come in now," she said softly. Ethan gave a slight shake of his head. "I was already here," he answered, and there was something in that simple truth that made everything else feel clearer. Clara adjusted the baby in her arms, then looked up at him, her voice quieter, now not from fatigue, but from something more deliberate. "What happens after this?" she asked, not expecting an answer, not expecting a plan. Just asking the question out loud. Ethan did not respond immediately, his gaze moving briefly to the window, where morning had fully taken hold, the gray now softening into pale light, then back to her, one step at a time. He said, and it was not a promise, not a solution, just a way forward. Clara held that answer for a moment, letting it settle where everything else had settled over the past hours. Not perfect, not complete, but enough to move forward, enough to begin. And as the morning light filled the room completely, Clara realized that the night had taken something from her: fear, isolation, uncertainty, but it had also given something back, something she had not expected to find in a place like this. Something quiet, something steady, something that stood just a few feet away and had never once turned toward the door to leave. The morning grew fuller with sound as footsteps passed more frequently outside the room, voices a little louder. Now the hospital, no longer wrapped in the quiet of night, but waking into its steady rhythm. Clara noticed it in small ways: the soft knock of a cart rolling by, the distant murmur of conversation, the faint clink of metal against metal somewhere down the hall. It all felt distant yet real, like the world had resumed its pace while she remained in a moment that still belonged to her. She adjusted slightly against the pillows, her body reminding her of everything it had just carried through, not with pain, but with a heaviness that asked for stillness. The baby stirred again, a small movement that drew her attention instantly, her hand moving gently across the blanket, a quiet reassurance, more for herself than for the child. Ethan remained where he was, near the foot of the bed, not intruding, not distant, simply present, his posture unchanged, though the light in the room had shifted, revealing more detail: the dust along his boots, the wear in the fabric of his coat, the kind of details that told a story. Without speaking, Clara studied those details for a moment longer than before, not out of curiosity, but out of recognition. This man had not stepped into her world prepared or polished. He had arrived as he was, and stayed that way without apology. The nurse returned once more, clipboard in hand, her tone calm, but practical. "We will need to go over some information," she said, glancing at Clara. "Basic paperwork, discharge planning. When the time comes." Clara nodded slowly, though the words felt heavier than they should have. Planning required direction, and direction required something she had not thought about yet. Ethan shifted slightly, his attention turning toward the nurse as she continued. "We will also need a contact address, someone to coordinate with after discharge." The nurse paused, then looked between them, not assuming, but not ignoring what she had seen. Clara felt that pause settle into her chest, not as pressure, but as awareness. She glanced down at the baby, then back up, her voice quiet but steady. "I do not have anyone." She said the words simple but clear. The nurse's expression softened just slightly, then turned toward Ethan, not demanding, just acknowledging the space he had already stepped into. Ethan met that look without hesitation. "You can put me down." He said the same words as before, but this time they carried further beyond the walls of the room. The nurse nodded, making a note without question, as if the decision had already been understood. Clara watched that exchange carefully, something about it different from before, not just a moment, not just a night, but something that extended outward into what came next. "You do not even know where I will go after this," Clara said softly, not doubting, just stating the truth. Ethan considered that for a brief moment, his gaze shifting toward the window, where morning had fully taken hold, then back to her. "Then we will figure that out when we get there," he replied, and again it was not a plan, not a promise, just a direction. Clara held those words quietly, letting them settle alongside everything else that had been said and not said. The nurse finished her notes, then offered a small nod. "I will give you both some time," she said before stepping out, closing the door gently behind her. The room returned to its quiet, not empty, but steady. Clara looked down at the baby again, her fingers brushing lightly across the small blanket, then lifted her gaze toward Ethan, something unspoken passing between them, not heavy, not uncertain, just real. "You keep saying we," she said after a moment, her voice calm. Ethan did not look away. "That is because I am still here," he answered simply. Clara let out a slow breath, not from fatigue, but from understanding. The word "we" did not mean everything. It did not promise forever. It did not solve what lay ahead, but it meant something. It meant she was not standing at the edge of it alone, and as the morning light filled the room completely, Clara realized that the next step did not feel as distant as it had before, not because she knew what it would be, but because someone had already chosen to take it with her. The room held a quiet that no longer felt fragile. It felt earned, like something that had settled after being tested. Clara sat with the baby resting against her chest, the small weight steady and warm, her breathing slower, now more, even though the exhaustion lingered in the way her shoulders leaned slightly into the pillows. The morning light had grown stronger, filling the corners of the room, touching the edges of everything it reached, as if making it all more real, more present. Ethan remained where he had been, not far, not close, simply within reach of the moment, his hands resting loosely in front of him, his posture unchanged, as if time moved around him, but did not pull him away. Clara watched him for a moment longer than before, not searching, not questioning, just seeing him in the full light of morning, the lines in his face clearer, now the quiet in his expression unchanged. "You have not asked me anything," she said after a while, her voice calm, not guarded. Ethan lifted his gaze, slightly meeting hers without hesitation. "You will tell me what matters when you are ready," he answered, and there was no pressure in it, no expectation, just space. Clara considered that response, letting it sit with everything else that had been said and not said. The baby shifted softly, drawing her attention back, down her hand, moving gently to steady the small movement. "Her name," Ethan said quietly, not as a question, but as something he knew would come. Clara looked at him, then back at the child, her fingers brushing lightly across the blanket, as if the name might be written there already, waiting to be read. "I have not chosen one yet," she admitted, her voice softer now. Ethan nodded once. "You will know when it is time," he said, and again it was simple, but certain, the kind of certainty that did not come from knowing everything, but from trusting the moment. The door opened with a soft knock, and another nurse stepped in, carrying a clipboard and a small folder, her tone professional, but warmer than before. "We will need to finalize a few details before discharge," she said, glancing between Clara and Ethan, her eyes pausing just long enough to recognize what had already been established. She stepped closer, placing the folder gently on the small table beside the bed. "Insurance information, address, emergency contact," she listed calmly. Clara felt a familiar tension stir, not sharp, Not overwhelming, just present, a reminder that the world outside this room still required answers she did not, yet have. Her gaze dropped briefly to the folder, then lifted again toward Ethan. He did not move right away, did not step forward, or take control. He simply waited, allowing her the space to respond. Clara took a slow breath, then spoke. "I do not have insurance," she said plainly. The nurse nodded without surprise, marking something on the page. "We can arrange assistance for that," she replied, then looked up again. "And an address for after discharge." Clara hesitated, not from uncertainty, but from truth. "I do not have one yet," she said, and this time the room held that answer for a second longer than the last. The nurse's expression softened again, her eyes shifting briefly toward Ethan, not asking, but acknowledging the possibility that had been quietly growing. Ethan stepped forward, just enough to close the distance, not taking the moment from Clara, but standing beside it. "You can use mine," he said, his voice steady, not louder than before, but carrying further. Now the nurse gave a small nod, writing it down, without hesitation, as if the decision fit naturally into the space it filled. Clara looked at him carefully, something deeper moving beneath the surface of her expression, not doubt, not disbelief, but recognition of what that meant. "You are making this very easy for someone you just met," she said softly. Ethan met her gaze without shifting. "It is not easy," he answered. "It is just right." And that answer stayed in the room longer than any of the others. The nurse finished her notes, then closed the folder with a quiet motion. "We will return shortly with the final paperwork," she said before stepping out, leaving the door slightly open this time, as if the room no longer needed to be closed off. Clara sat in the quiet that followed, her eyes moving between the baby in her arms and the man standing beside her, not a stranger anymore, not something defined by a single moment, but something that had grown through each choice, each word, each silence. And as the light of morning fully claimed the room, Clara realized that what had begun as a single act had become something more, not something named, not something certain, but something that would carry forward beyond this space into whatever came next. And for the first time, she did not feel the need to hold back from that possibility, because it was already there, standing quietly beside her, waiting not to be proven, but to be lived. The door remained slightly open after the nurse left, and for the first time since the night began, the room did not feel like a place that kept things in. It felt like a place that allowed things to move forward. Clara noticed it in the way the light stretched further across the floor, in the way the sounds from the hallway no longer felt distant, but connected, like she was part of something again instead of standing outside of it. She adjusted the baby, gently lifting her just enough to rest more comfortably against her shoulder, the small head fitting into that space as if it had always belonged there. The child made a soft sound, then settled again, and Clara let out a slow breath, her body following that rhythm, her mind catching up to everything that had changed. Ethan had not moved far. He stood near the window, now his gaze resting on the morning outside, not searching, just taking it in, as if measuring something that did not need to be spoken. Clara watched him for a moment, the way he held still, even when everything around him shifted, the way he did not fill the silence, but did not leave it either. "You seem used to staying in places like this," she said quietly, not accusing, not assuming, just noticing. Ethan glanced back at her, then toward the window again. "I am used to not leaving when it matters," he replied, and the answer settled into the room without needing anything added. Clara nodded slowly, not fully understanding the past behind those words, but recognizing the truth inside them. The baby stirred again, a little more this time, and Clara instinctively rocked her, slightly emotion that came easier, now more natural. "She needs a name," Ethan said after a moment, not pressing, just reminding. Clara looked down at the child, her expression softer than it had been all morning. "I know," she said, her voice thoughtful, her fingers tracing lightly across the blanket, as if feeling for something hidden there. "I just want it to mean something," she added, and Ethan gave a small nod. "Then it will," he said simply, and again it was not a guess, not a hope, just a quiet certainty that did not ask to be proven. The door opened again, this time more fully, and a different voice entered, older, steadier, a woman in a dark jacket, carrying a thin folder, her presence calm but purposeful. "Miss Whitmore," she said, gently stepping into the room. "I am here to go over your discharge support and assistance options." Clara shifted slightly, sitting a little straighter, not from tension, but from attention. The woman offered a small, reassuring smile, then glanced briefly at Ethan, not questioning, just acknowledging. "You have someone with you," she noted. Clara followed that glance, then looked back at the woman. "Yes," she said simply, and that one word held more weight than anything else she had said that morning. The woman nodded, opening the folder. We can help arrange temporary housing, medical support, and follow-up care. She explained, her tone even and clear. It will not solve everything, but it will give you a place to start. Clara listened carefully, each word landing with a different kind of weight than the ones before, not heavy, not overwhelming, just real, something she could hold on to, something she could build from. She glanced toward Ethan again, not asking, not needing approval, just sharing the moment. He gave a slight nod, not stepping in, not taking over, just present in the same quiet way he had been from the beginning. That sounds like a good start, Clara said finally, her voice steadier than it had been before. The woman smiled again, making a note. We will begin the paperwork shortly, she said before stepping back toward the door, giving them space. Once more the room settled again, but this time it felt different, not closed, not waiting, but open, like something had been set in motion. Clara looked down at the baby again, her expression thoughtful, then lifted her gaze toward Ethan. I think I know her name, she said quietly. Ethan met her eyes without hesitation. Then you should say it, he replied. Clara took a small breath, then looked back down at the child, her voice soft but certain. Hope, she said, and the word did not echo, it did not need to, it simply stayed right where it was, filling the space between them in a way that felt complete. Ethan nodded, once not smiling, not reacting in any big way, just accepting it like he had accepted everything else. And in that moment Clara realized that some things did not need to be celebrated loudly, some things only needed to be recognized for what they were and held on to as they carried forward into whatever came next. And for the first time since everything began, she felt ready to do exactly that. The words stayed in the room longer than anything else had that morning, not because it was loud, but because it fit. Hope. Clara repeated it quietly this time, not to say it again, but to feel how it settled in her chest, how it aligned with everything that had happened. Without asking for more, the baby shifted slightly, as if responding to the sound, or maybe just to the warmth of being held. Clara adjusted her gently, her movements slower, now more certain, like her hands had already learned what her mind was still catching up to. Ethan stood where he had been, near the window, the light now full against his shoulders, outlining him in a way that made him look both part of the room and separate from it at the same time. He did not speak right away. He did not need to. Some moments did not ask for words, they asked for recognition, and he gave that with a small nod, the kind that did not interrupt, but confirmed. Clara noticed it, and something about that quiet acceptance made the name feel even more real, not something she was trying out, not something temporary, but something that belonged. The door opened again, and the woman with the folder returned, stepping in with the same steady presence as before. We have arranged a temporary place for you, she said, her voice calm and clear. It is not far from here, a small apartment, fully furnished. You will have access to follow-up care and support services for the next few months. Clara listened carefully, her attention focused not just on the words, but on what they meant, something solid, something she could step into when she left this room. There will also be assistance with transportation and supplies, the woman continued. Everything you need to get started. Clara nodded slowly, the information settling into place one piece at a time. She glanced toward Ethan again, not because she needed his reaction, but because his presence had become part of how she understood things now. He met her glance briefly, then returned it, with that same quiet steadiness. No interruption, no addition, just there. The woman closed the folder gently. We will finalize everything before discharge this afternoon, she said, then paused, looking between them. You are not alone in this, she added, and for a brief second the words echoed something that had already been proven, not said for the first time, but confirmed. Clara let out a small breath, not from relief, but from something deeper, something that felt like grounding. Thank you, she said, and this time the words carried more than politeness, they carried recognition. The woman gave a slight nod, then stepped back, leaving the door open again, as if nothing here needed to be closed off anymore. The room returned to its quiet, but it was not the same quiet as before. It held direction now, it held movement. Clara looked down at Hope again, saying the name silently, this time her thumb brushing lightly across the baby's small hand, the fingers curled around her skin instinctively. And Clara felt that simple connection anchor her more firmly than anything else. Could she lifted her gaze toward Ethan after a moment, her expression thoughtful, not uncertain, not hesitant, just aware. You do not have to keep going with us, she said softly, not pushing him away, but giving him the space to step back if he chose. Ethan did not answer, Immediately his eyes moved briefly toward the open doorway, the hallway beyond, then back to Clara and the child in her arms. "I know," he said, and for a second it seemed like that was all he would say, but then he added quietly, "But I am not done yet." Clara studied that answer, letting it settle in the same place everything else had settled, not questioning it, not asking for more, because she understood now that what he gave was always enough, not more, not less, just what was real. Outside the room, the hospital continued its steady rhythm, people, moving voices, carrying life, unfolding as it always did, but inside that space something had shifted into a new shape, not fragile, not uncertain, something that could be carried forward. Clara adjusted the blanket around Hope once more, then leaned back slightly, allowing herself to rest into the moment, not because everything was solved, but because something had begun. Something that would move beyond this room, beyond this morning, into whatever waited next. And for the first time, she did not feel like she was stepping into it alone. She felt like she was stepping into it with someone who had already chosen to walk beside her, and that made all the difference. The hours that followed did not rush. They unfolded in quiet pieces, the kind that do not demand attention, but shape everything all the same. Clara sat with Hope resting against her chest, the small, steady breathing now familiar, the weight no longer surprising, but grounding. The room carried a calm that felt different from before, not the stillness of waiting, but the stillness of something settled, something that had found its place. The paperwork came and went, voices entered, then softened, then left again, each step moving things forward without breaking. The quiet Ethan remained through it all, not standing apart anymore, but not taking more space than was his. He signed where needed, spoke when asked, his voice steady, measured, like everything he did. When the final papers were placed in Clara's hands, she looked at them for a moment, not reading every word, but understanding what they meant. This was the line between what had been and what would come next. She lifted her gaze toward Ethan. "This is where it changes," she said softly, not as a question, but as a truth. Ethan nodded once. "It already did," he replied, and there was no weight in it, no drama, just fact. The nurse returned with a small bag, supplies carefully arranged inside, things Clara would need in the first days, things she had not expected to have. "You are all set," the nurse said with a gentle smile, then paused, looking at Clara and then at Ethan. "Take care of each other," she added before stepping back, giving them space to leave on their own time. Clara stood slowly, careful with her movements, adjusting Hope in her arms. The baby stirred slightly, then settled again, as if trusting the motion, trusting the hands that held her. Ethan moved without being asked, picking up the small bag and stepping toward the door, but not opening it. Yet he waited. Clara took a breath, then another, grounding herself in the moment before stepping forward. The door opened into a hallway that no longer felt distant. It felt like a path, the same lights, the same floors, the same quiet rhythm, but now it led somewhere. The two of them walked side by side, not speaking, not needing, to their pace, unhurried, each step measured, not because they were unsure, but because they understood that this was something to move through, not rush past. When they reached the exit, the light outside was brighter than it had been all morning. The sky opened, the air carrying a softness that had not been there before. Clara paused just at the threshold, not stopping completely, just enough to feel the shift from inside to out. Ethan stepped slightly ahead, opening the door fully, then stepping back again, allowing her to pass first, not leading, not following, just walking beside her. Clara stepped into the light, holding Hope close. The air felt different, not just on her skin, but somewhere deeper, like it marked something real, something that had begun hours ago, and now continued forward. She turned slightly toward Ethan, not searching, not asking, just acknowledging. "You stayed," she said again, not because it needed to be said, but because it mattered. Ethan met her gaze for a moment, then looked out toward the open space ahead. "So did you," he replied, and there was something in that answer that held everything, not just the night, not just the moment, but the choice to keep moving forward. Clara looked down at Hope, then back up the word she had chosen, resting quietly between them, not needing to be repeated, because it was already there in everything they did. They walked forward, then not towards something certain, not towards something defined, but towards something shared. The path ahead open, not empty, but waiting, and as they moved into it side by side, there was no need for promises, no need for declarations, just the quiet understanding that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stay, and sometimes that is enough to change everything.